"That embarrassing old car," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Still driving that thing, Irene?" The laughter came easy. It always did at his reunions. I didn't answer. I just stood there in the evening light, holding my keys, watching 30 people I barely knew decide what I was worth based on a vehicle. Then someone across the parking lot, an old man in a veteran's cap, went very still. He looked at me the way people only look at you when they already know the ending. "Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your country and your local time in the comments right now." It always means something to see who's out there. Now let me take you back to where this really started. A few hours earlier, I almost didn't go. That's the part nobody saw. The part that happened in the kitchen at 4:30, when Mark was upstairs getting dressed and I was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, trying to talk myself into putting on shoes. I'm 48 years old. I've flown into weather that would make most people's hair go white. I've hovered over burning decks at 2 a.m. with 40-knot crosswinds and a crew of 4, depending on every decision I made in the next 30 seconds. I know what fear feels like when it's real, the shaky, electric kind that sits in your chest and won't let you breathe shallow. What I felt that afternoon wasn't that kind of fear. It was smaller, quieter. The kind that doesn't have a name but sits in the back of your throat like something you swallowed wrong. Mark had been talking about this reunion for 6 weeks. His 20th. The kind of event where men who peaked in their late 20s stand around measuring invisible things. Job titles, neighborhoods. The kind of car in the driveway. He'd been restless the whole month leading up to it. Checking the Facebook group, mentioning names I didn't recognize. Ironing shirts he didn't need to iron. I understood what he needed from me that night. He needed me to be pleasant and quiet and not embarrassing. That's not a cruel thing to say about a husband. It's just true. Mark and I had built a life that worked well on the outside. A house in Virginia, 2 decent incomes, a dog named Biscuit who shed on everything. We were polite to each other, sometimes warm, but there was a gap somewhere in the middle of us that neither of us had found the language to talk about, and events like this one had a way of making that gap feel wider than usual. He didn't know what I did. Not really. That's my fault, I suppose. When I left the Navy 4 years ago, I came home and I let the silence fill in around me. I told people I'd worked for the government. Logistics. Nothing interesting. And most people, if you say it flat enough and move on fast enough, will take that answer and not pull at the thread. Mark pulled a little, early on. But I was tired in those years, the kind of tired that goes deeper than sleep can fix, and every time he got close to a real question, I found a way to redirect. Eventually, he stopped asking. I told myself that was fine. I told myself it was easier. Older Americans understand something about this that younger people sometimes don't. There are things you carry home from certain kinds of work that don't belong at the dinner table. Not because they're shameful, because they're heavy, and you learn pretty quickly that setting them down in the wrong place, in front of people who don't have the context, doesn't lighten the load. It just makes a mess. So I kept mine in a box, labeled it government work, moved on. The car was part of that in a way. It's a 2003 Silverado. Gray, more rust than it deserves probably, but it runs. The heater works. The radio picks up 3 stations on a good day. I bought it secondhand the year I came home because I didn't want anything that felt new. I needed something that had already been through things. Something that understood what it meant to still be moving when you had no real right to be. Mark hated it from the start. He drove a Lexus, clean, silver, quiet. He mentioned the truck every few months in that careful way people mention things they want you to change without actually asking you to change them. A half joke here, a raised eyebrow there. I always let it pass. That afternoon, standing at the counter, I thought about taking his car, just to make the night easier, just to skip whatever moment was coming. I didn't. I poured the cold coffee down the drain. I put on my navy blue dress. Plain, no jewelry worth mentioning, and I told myself the same thing I used to say before difficult flights. 1 hour at a time. You don't have to know the whole route. Just get off the ground. The drive to the Fairview Country Club took 22 minutes. I remember because I counted. The sun was low and orange over the Virginia hills, and there was a country station playing something slow and familiar that I didn't know the name of. Biscuit had tried to follow me out the door, and I'd had to block him with my knee, and I was still thinking about his face, that long, confused dog face. When I pulled into the parking lot, Mark was already out of his car and moving toward the entrance, straightening his jacket, scanning the crowd for people he knew. He spotted a group near the door and his whole posture changed. Shoulders back, bigger smile. The Mark he wanted to be around these people. He turned back once, saw me climbing down from the truck, and something crossed his face. Not cruelty. Something softer and worse than cruelty. Embarrassment. I smoothed my dress and walked toward him, and he said quietly, not quite looking at me, "You couldn't have driven my car?" I didn't answer. The evening was warm for September, cicadas going in the tree line. The club smelled the way those places always smell. Cut grass and something floral being pumped through the ventilation. Underneath it, all the faint ghost of old money. Round tables with white cloths, a bar set up near the far wall, and maybe 60 people spreading out across the terrace like they were performing for each other. I got a glass of water. I found a spot near the edge of things. I did what I've always done in rooms like that. I watched. I kept quiet. I stayed small, and across the terrace, near the low stone wall where the light was dimmer, an old man in a veteran's cap sat alone in a lawn chair, not talking to anyone. He had the hands of someone who had done real work with them for a long time. He was watching the crowd the way I was, not anxious, not bored, just taking the measure of things. He wasn't looking at me yet, but the night was still young. Mark found his people within 10 minutes. That's the right word for them, I think. His people. The ones who remembered him before mortgages and commutes and the slow grinding math of middle age. There were maybe 8 of them clustered near the bar. Men in blazers, women in heels that were slightly too high for a terrace. Everyone doing that specific kind of laughing that's really just signaling. Look how well we turned out. Look how easy this all is for us. I recognized the dynamic. I'd seen it in military circles too, though it looked different there. In the Navy, the measuring was quieter. You didn't brag about rank, you let your record speak. If your record was real, people already knew. If it wasn't, all the talking in the world wouldn't change that. Here, the talking was the point. I stayed near the edge of the terrace with my water glass and watched Mark slide back into a version of himself I didn't see very often at home. Looser, louder. The college version of him, or something close to it. He had his hand on someone's shoulder and was telling a story I couldn't hear from where I stood, and the group was leaning in the way groups do when the person talking is exactly where they want to be. I was glad for him. In a distant sort of way, a woman named Patty found me around the 20-minute mark. She was sweet, the kind of woman who fills silences out of genuine kindness rather than nerves, and she asked me about the drive up and whether we had kids and what I did for work. I told her government work, logistics. She nodded and told me about her job in real estate in Charlotte, and I asked her questions and listened and was grateful to have something to do with my face. Then Mark appeared. He came with 2 men I hadn't met, Greg and Davis. Apparently the kind of names that come with alumni newsletters and country club memberships. Greg was broad-shouldered with the easy confidence of someone who had always been told yes. Davis was thinner, sharper, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful but calculating. They were both looking at me with that particular expression men get when they're being introduced to someone's wife and have already made up their minds about her. "This is Irene," Mark said. "No, my wife, just Irene." Offered up like a fact. "What do you drive to get here?" Greg asked. Not unfriendly, just making conversation. I saw some sorry-looking Silverado out front taking up 2 spaces. 1 space. For the record, Mark laughed before I could speak. "That's hers," he said. "Still driving that thing, Irene?" He shook his head like it was an old joke we'd worn smooth together. I've been trying to get her into something decent for 3 years. She won't hear it, Greg smiled. Davis looked at the truck like it had personally disappointed him. Some people, Davis said, just don't care how they come across. He said it pleasantly. That's what made it land the way it did. Not a shout, not a sneer, just a smooth, offhand observation. The kind that's designed to sound like a general statement while pointing directly at one person. Patty looked at her shoes. I took a sip of water. Mark laughed again. The slightly too loud laugh of a man who is uncomfortable in covering it. She works for the government, he said, by way of explanation, as though that settled something. As though it explained the truck, the plain dress, the failure to perform. Logistics, I added. Right, said Greg, already looking past me. People over 60 will know this particular sensation. The moment in a social gathering when you realize you've been quietly sorted. Filed under unimportant. It doesn't always stings. Sometimes it's almost a relief. You know where you stand, and you can organize yourself accordingly. I organized myself toward the stone wall and the old man in the veteran's cap. He was still there. Still watching the crowd with that calm, unimpressed attention. Up close, he was somewhere in his mid-70s, weathered in the specific way that speaks of years outdoors rather than years at a desk, with a jaw that had gone slack with age but eyes that hadn't. Sharp, gray eyes that moved with purpose. His cap said U.S. Navy. Below that, the word veteran in gold thread, slightly faded. Mind if I sit? I asked. He gestured at the empty chair beside him without looking away from the terrace. Suit yourself. We sat in comfortable silence for a minute. The cicadas were loud in the tree line. Someone had turned the music up inside, and a Frank Sinatra song drifted out through the open doors. Something slow. Something about the way a night can change everything. You don't look like you want to be here, he said, finally. Not unkind. Just observational. I'm fine, I said. Didn't say you weren't. He looked at me sideways. Just said you don't want to be here. I smiled despite myself. No, I said. Not especially. He nodded like that was the sensible answer. His hands rested on his knees, those big, worked-over hands. And he was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, whose husband? I pointed toward Mark's group without looking over. Ah, he watched them for a moment. The one telling the story, he tells good stories, I said. And that was true. It was one of the things I'd loved about him once. The old man made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Lot of that going around tonight. He introduced himself as Walter Hayes. Doc, she said. Most people called him. Father of one of the alumni. His son was somewhere inside, he thought, though he'd lost track. He'd come because his son asked him to, and because he didn't have anywhere better to be on a Saturday in September. Navy, I said, nodding at his cap. Corpsman, he said. 2 tours. Long time ago, he paused. You? I almost said logistics. I don't know why I didn't. Something about the way he asked it. Flat and unhurried. Like a man who had learned the hard way that the truth was easier in the long run. Navy, I said. I flew. He turned to look at me then. The full weight of those gray eyes. Helicopters, I said. He was quiet for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not recognition yet, but the edge of it. The way a word sounds familiar before you can place it. What squadron? He asked. And across the terrace, Mark was laughing again, his voice carrying over the music and the cicadas and the warm September air, and I thought about lying, and I didn't. I told him, and Walter, Doc, Hayes went very, very still. He didn't say anything right away. That's the thing about men who've seen real things. They don't rush to fill the silence. They let information settle the way sediment settles in water. Slowly until the picture clarifies. Doc Hayes sat with what I'd told him for a good 15 seconds, which is longer than it sounds when you're the one waiting. Then he said, HSC 28? Yes, I said, another pause. His hands tightened slightly on his knees. Not agitation. Something else. The way your grip changes when you're steadying yourself. You deployed out of Norfolk, he said. It wasn't a question. 2 tours, I said. 3rd deployment cut short, he nodded slowly. The music from inside had shifted to something instrumental now, quieter, and the terrace crowd had thinned a little as people drifted in for food. Mark's group was still at the bar. I could see him gesturing, a big, expansive gesture that meant the story was reaching its climax. What years? Doc asked. I told him. He closed his eyes for just a moment. One breath in, one breath out. When he opened them again, he was looking at the tree line rather than at me, and his voice when he spoke was careful. I was in Bahrain, he said. 2009. Medical support attached to a joint task force. He stopped. There was a night. Late October, I think, though I've gone back and forth on the date over the years, when they brought in a rescue crew. Bad weather. Real bad. The kind of night the tower shouldn't have cleared anybody to fly. The cicadas were very loud. I kept my face still. I was in the hangar when they landed, he said. I worked on 2 of the guys they pulled out. One of them kept asking about the pilot. Wouldn't let me work on him until I told him the pilot was okay. He paused again. I didn't know if the pilot was okay. I lied and said yes to get him to hold still. I looked at my water glass. The pilot's call sign, Doc said quietly, was Halo. People over 60 know there are moments in life that don't announce themselves. No swell of music, no dramatic shift in the light. Just an ordinary evening on an ordinary terrace. Cicadas going in the tree line, a Frank Sinatra song fading out inside, and a sentence that rearranges everything quietly the way tides rearrange a shoreline without anyone watching. I said yes. Doc turned to look at me fully. Those gray eyes steady and serious, and something else. Something that took me a moment to name. Gratitude. The old, weathered kind that doesn't perform itself. The kind that has been sitting in a man's chest for 15 years waiting for a place to land. You were flying that bird, he said. I was, I said. He nodded once, the way you nod when a long equation finally balances. We sat with that for a while. Neither of us felt the need to make it larger than it was. That's another thing about people who've been through certain things. They don't dress up the significant moments. They just let them be significant. Across the terrace, I heard Mark laugh again. That too loud laugh. And then Greg's voice carrying over, saying something I couldn't quite catch, and then another burst of laughter from the group. And then Mark's voice saying clearly, I mean, what can you do? Some people are just content with mediocre. He wasn't looking at me when he said it. He might not have even been talking about me. But Patty, standing at the edge of that group, glanced over in my direction, and that told me enough. To heard it too. I saw his jaw tighten slightly. Your husband, he said, not quite a question. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Does he know? No, I said. Locke looked at me steadily. Why not? It's a fair question. I've asked it myself, standing in the kitchen at odd hours, or lying awake at 3 a.m. with biscuits' weight against my legs and the house quiet around me. Why not? Why keep carrying a thing alone when you don't have to? Because explaining it means going through all of it, I said. The whole weight of it. And I've never found the right moment. And then enough time passed that not saying, it became its own kind of habit. Doc considered that. He didn't tell me I was wrong. He didn't tell me I was right. He just said, my wife didn't know the half of what I carried home for the first 12 years. I told myself the same thing. Right moment. Right time. He looked at his hands. There's no right moment. There's just the moment you decide. I know, I said. Do you? I didn't answer that. Partly because I wasn't sure. Partly because across the terrace, Mark's group had shifted, and Davis, the thin, sharp one, was walking in our direction with a fresh drink and the relaxed momentum of a man who owns every room he enters. He slowed when he saw me sitting with Doc. He looked at Doc's veteran's cap, then at me, and something in his expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. The way people recalibrate when they realize a piece of furniture might actually be structural. Making friends? He said to me pleasantly. Sitting, I said. Davis nodded at Doc's cap. Thank you for your service, he said. The automatic kind. The kind people say the way they say have a nice day. Doc looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, sure. Davis lingered a half-second longer, as if deciding whether to sit down, then decided against it and moved on. I watched him go. He's one of them, Doc said. Not a question, he's one of them, I confirmed. Locke shifted in his chair. He rolled his neck once, the careful, deliberate movement of a man whose body had logged a lot of miles, and looked back at the tree line. You know, he said, I've been sitting here for 2 hours watching that group over there. I can read a room. He paused. Whatever's coming tonight, you don't have to manage it alone. I looked at him. I'm 74 years old, he said simply. I've got nowhere to be and nothing to protect. That's a useful thing to have on your side. The music inside changed again. Something with a beat now, younger, out of place, and from Mark's group came another burst of laughter, and this time I heard my name in it, just the edge of it, just enough to know. Doc heard it too. He looked at me with those steady gray eyes and said very quietly, "Tell me your call sign again," and when I said it, something shifted in his posture, something straightened, the way old soldiers straighten when a name means something. And I understood that the night was no longer going the way anyone had planned. It started with a question that wasn't really a question. Mark had come looking for me. I think he'd noticed I'd been gone from the main group for too long, and in that particular social arithmetic, he ran in his head. At events like this, an absent wife was a variable that needed accounting for. He crossed the terrace with his drink and his blazer and that careful smile, and he stopped when he saw me sitting with Doc Hayes. He looked at Doc, he looked at me, he looked at Doc again. "Making yourself comfortable over here?" he said to me. Light tone. "The kind that has a floor under it. Just talking," I said. He glanced at Doc's veteran's cap, did the same automatic nod Davis had done. "Thank you for your service." Then, to me, with that half smile that I knew meant something sharper underneath, Greg was asking where you'd gone. "We're doing introductions. What people do for work, where they've ended up." He tilted his head slightly. "Come tell them about logistics." There was something in the way he said it. Not cruel, exactly, but deliberate. Logistics, said in that tone, in that company, meant something specific. It meant not impressive. It meant don't embarrass me, but also there's not much to embarrass me with. Doc said nothing. He just watched. I stood up, smoothed my dress, picked up my water glass. I followed Mark back across the terrace. The group had grown to 10 or 12 people by then. Greg and Davis were there, and Patty, and several others I'd been introduced to and forgotten, and 2 men I hadn't met yet who turned out to be brothers, Tom and Bill Carey. Tom was heavyset with a kind face. Bill was quieter, watching everything from behind rimless glasses. Greg was in the middle of a story about a business trip to Tokyo. He wrapped it up when we arrived and turned to me with that broad, easy smile. "So, Mark tells us you work for the government," he said. "I did," I said. "I'm retired now? Retired already?" "Lucky. What branch?" It was an innocent enough question, the kind people ask at parties, and I almost answered the way I always answered. Logistics, federal contractor, nothing interesting. But I could feel Doc Hayes watching from across the terrace, and I thought about what he'd said. "There's no right moment. There's just the moment you decide, Navy," I said. A small shift in the group. Not dramatic. Just a slight reorientation, the way a room adjusts when the topic changes register. "Huh," said Greg. "What'd you do in the Navy?" "I flew helicopters, another shift." Larger this time, Mark was very still beside me. "Combat?" asked Special Carry, the quiet one with the glasses. His voices had changed, become more precise. "Search and rescue," I said. "Combat, SAR. 2 deployments to the Persian Gulf, 1 to the Horn of Africa." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. Not the silence of disinterest. The silence of recalibration. Davis said, carefully, "I didn't realize the Navy had women in those roles." "They do," I said. "That's..." "Huh." Greg looked at Mark. "You didn't mention that." Mark's jaw was tight. "She doesn't like to talk about it." "You didn't know," said Bill Carey quietly. He wasn't accusing. He was just noting a fact the way precise people note facts. Mark looked at him. "Of course I knew. Nobody said anything to that." And then, from behind me, a voice I recognized, Halo. Doc had crossed the terrace. He was moving slowly, the careful walk of a man with bad knees. But he was moving with total certainty, the way men move when they know exactly why they're going somewhere. He stopped at the edge of our group and looked at me with those gray eyes and said it again. Halo. That was your call sign. The word landed in the group like a stone in still water. I watched the rings move out from it. The slight furrowing of brows, the exchanged glances, the shift from social conversation posture to something more alert. Yes, I said. Locke turned to the group. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He just spoke the way men speak when they're delivering a fact they've been carrying for a long time and have finally found the right place to set it down. October 2009, he said. Bahrain. Weather so bad the duty officer almost scrubbed the whole operation. They didn't because the window was closing and there were men in the water. He paused. This woman flew into that. 4 hours in conditions that grounded everything else on the flight deck. She brought out 9 men. 9. Another pause. I worked on 2 of them in the hangar. I've thought about that night for 15 years. The terrace had gone quiet. Not just our group. The people nearby had stilled too, the way crowds go still when something real cuts through all the noise. Greg's drink was halfway to his mouth and had stopped there. Davis had taken a small step back, almost without seeming to know it. Mark was looking at me like he was seeing something he didn't have a word for yet. Bill Carey said softly, "Commander?" I looked at him. "Your rank," he said. "When you're tired?" "Yes," I said. He nodded once, then he did something that surprised me. He straightened up, not performatively, not for the crowd, just a quiet, physical acknowledgement, and said, "Thank you for your service, Commander Sullivan." It was the first time anyone at that party had used my rank. The sound of it did something to the air. Patty had both hands pressed over her mouth. Greg had finally lowered his drink. Davis was looking at the ground somewhere to his left, the way people look when they're doing a private recalculation they'd rather not do in public. And Mark was standing very still with his blazer and his party smile, and both of those things had stopped working. The smile wasn't there anymore. The ease wasn't there. He looked like a man who had been in a room he thought he knew and had just discovered it had another floor. He said very quietly, to no one in particular, 9 men. Doc looked at him steadily. 9, he confirmed, that we know of. Tom Carey exhaled listlessly beside his brother. Lord, he said, under his breath. The cicadas went on in the tree line. The party went on somewhere inside. And on the terrace in the warm September air, the world that had existed 20 minutes ago, the one where I was a woman with an embarrassing truck and a nothing job who didn't know how to come across, was gone. Mark turned to look at me then. Really look at me. And I saw it in his face. Not pride, not yet, maybe not ever in the way I'd once hoped for. Something rawer than pride. The specific look of a man realizing he has badly misread a room he thought was simple. Doc put a hand briefly on my arm, the lightest touch, just a second, and said very quietly, "Just for me, I was on that bird." And then, "There's something else you should know." He said it the way men say things they've rehearsed for years without meaning to. Not a speech. Not a performance. Just a sentence that had been sitting in him so long it had worn its own groove. "I was on that bird," Doc said again. Quieter this time, just for me, not as a patient. I volunteered as medical support for the extraction team. They needed a corpsman who could ride in a rescue helo in those conditions and not lose his head. He paused. I'd done it twice before. So I went. I looked at him. "I never got your name afterward," he said. Everything moved fast. Debrief, triage, transport. By the time I asked, your crew had been reassigned to another operation. I asked around for a while. Then I stopped asking because I figured you'd gone on to the next thing. The way people do in that life. I understood that. The way people do in that life. You move to the next thing. Because standing still is how you start feeling the weight of what you've just done. And there isn't always time for that. And eventually you learn to keep moving and carry it with you and just become a person who moves a little slower than they used to. "What do you want to know?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted you to know that I was there. That someone who was there knows what it cost. People over 60 understand something about those words. What it cost, not what it took. That's the version we use in public, the cleaner version, the one that fits inside a thank you card. What it cost is different. What it costs lives in the body, in the places that don't show on an X-ray. I nodded. And then, because he'd not with me, I was honest with him. We lost one, I said. The group had drifted slightly, giving us space without making a show of it. Mark was standing with Tom and Bill Carey about 10 feet away, not talking, just occupying space. I could see him in my peripheral vision listening, without appearing to listen. I know, Doc said. Petty Officer Second Class Daniel Reyes, I said. His name. I always say his name when I say what happened, because the habit was trained into me early. In that life, you don't say the one we lost or the casualty or the man who didn't make it. You say his name. He had one. He used it for 26 years and 8 months. Doc closed his eyes for just a moment. I know who he was, he said. I looked at him. I knew his mother, he said quietly, through a veterans support group years later. She reached out trying to understand what happened that night. All she had was the official report. He paused. Which didn't tell her much. That landed somewhere deep and specific in my chest, the official report. I knew what was in it. I knew what wasn't. I had written my own account 3 times in the weeks after, in the debrief, in the formal inquiry, in the statement I gave when the question of fault started moving toward me like weather on a radar screen. That night was not your fault, Doc said. I know, I said. He looked at me steadily. Do you? There it was again. The same question he'd asked earlier, about a different thing, and the answer was the same. Partly yes. Partly something more complicated than yes that I'd been working on for 4 years. In the quiet of early mornings and late nights when the house was dark and biscuit was warm against my legs, and I had nothing to do but sit with what I knew and what I felt and understand they weren't always the same thing. We were in a tight hover over the second extraction point, I said. Wave height was running 12 to 15 feet. The basket had just come up with 2 men in it. Danny was on the rescue swimmer line, in the water, securing the last survivor. I kept my voice even, the way I'd learned to keep it even in debrief rooms and inquiry offices. A rogue wave, bigger than the pattern, maybe 18 feet, maybe 20, came through the trough at an angle the forecasting hadn't caught. It hit the survivor. Danny took the impact trying to hold him. The line went taut. There was a mechanical failure in the hoist. I stopped. He went under in a trough. We circled for 40 minutes. We never found him. The cicadas, the music inside. Mark very still, 10 feet away. The inquiry found pilot error, I said. They said I'd held the hover too long in deteriorating conditions. Doc's jaw was tight. I disagreed, I said. I still disagree. But the inquiry concluded what it concluded. I was censured. Not dismissed, censured. I kept my rank. I finished the deployment, but something changed after that, in the rooms. In the way people looked at me, I paused. So I finished my 20, and I came home and I said I worked in logistics and I let the silence do what silence does. Doc was quiet for a long moment. The inquiry was wrong, he said. I know. I mean specifically wrong, he said. I was there. I saw the weather data afterward. I've talked to 2 members of that inquiry board over the years, informally, the way men talk when there's nothing left to protect. His voice was careful and exact. There was pressure to assign fault clearly, because the mission had political dimensions that nobody wanted aired publicly. You were the easiest clean answer, he looked at me. You were junior enough to absorb it and senior enough to seem credible as the responsible party. I'd known this. Parts of it. The way you know things you can't prove, not from documents but from silences. From the way certain conversations stopped when you entered rooms. From the things people didn't say in the years that followed. Hearing it said plainly by a man with no reason to lie, in the warm evening air of a Virginia country club, while my husband stood 10 feet away learning who I was a different thing than knowing it alone. I didn't cry. I'm not built for crying in company, and I never have been. But something in me that had been held at a specific tension for 4 years released slightly. Not all the way. Not in one evening. But slightly. The way a rope gives when the load it's been bearing is finally, partially, shared. There's one more thing, Doc said. He looked past me toward the terrace entrance. I turned, standing near the door, drink in hand, talking to the club manager with the comfortable authority of a man who expected doors to open for him, was a face I hadn't seen in 4 years. Rear Admiral Thomas Garrett, retired. The man who had run the inquiry, the man who had written the finding, the man who had stood in a room in Norfolk and told me, with the specific regret of someone performing regret rather than feeling it, that the board had reached its conclusion and that I should be grateful my career had survived it. He hadn't seen me yet. Locke said very quietly, "His son is class of 2004. That's why he's here. The world keeps moving anyway. That's the thing about it. You go 4 years without seeing a face, and then a September evening in Virginia puts it 20 feet away from you without asking permission. And all you can do is decide, in the next 10 seconds, what kind of person you're going to be when it happens." I took a slow breath. I straightened my shoulders. And I thought about Danny Reyes, and his name and what it cost. I didn't move toward him right away. That's important to understand. I'm not the kind of person who moves toward things before I'm ready. The Navy taught me that impulse and action are not the same thing, and that the space between them, that 2-second gap where you breathe and assess and decide, is where most of the important choices actually live. Pilots who close that gap too fast makes mistakes. Pilots who hold it, who sit in the discomfort of not yet acting for just a beat longer than feels natural, tend to come home, so I held it. Garrett was still talking to the club manager. He had the posture of a man accustomed to being the most significant person in any room. That specific stillness at the center of things, the way powerful men learn to stand so that the room orients around them rather than the other way. He was heavier than I remembered. His hair was fully white now. He wore a dark blazer and the kind of watch that announces itself without trying. Luke stood beside me, quiet, waiting. Behind me, I heard Mark say something low to Tom Carey. I didn't catch the words. I heard Tom's response, which was also low, and then silence. "How long has he been here?" I asked Doc. "I noticed him about an hour ago," Doc said. "I didn't know if you'd want to know. Why did you tell me?" He thought about that for a moment. "Because you deserve the choice," he said. "Whether to know or not, whether to act or not, that choice got taken from you once. Didn't seem right to take it again." I looked at him. "I'm 74, he said simply. "I've had time to think about what I'd do differently." Garrett laughed at something the club manager said. A full, relaxed laugh, the laugh of a man on comfortable ground, and clapped him once on the shoulder. The manager smiled the way people smile at men like Garrett, warmly, obligingly, with a fraction of themselves held in reserve. People over 60 know this type. They've seen them at every level of every institution. Military, corporate, civic, religious. Men who are competent enough to rise and political enough to stay risen, who have learned to move through the world in a way that costs other people more than it costs them. Not monsters. Something more ordinary, and in some ways more dangerous than monsters. Men who make self-serving calculations so consistently they've stopped experiencing them as calculations. They're just decisions, just the way things are, just the way the board concluded. I handed my water glass to Doc. "Stay here," I said. He took the glass without comment. I crossed the terrace. I wasn't walking fast. I wasn't walking with the energy of confrontation, which is a kind of performance, and I had nothing to perform. I walked the way I walk when I'm going somewhere I need to go, steadily, without hurry, with my full weight behind each step. Garrett saw me when I was about 8 feet away. I watched the recognition arrive in his face. It came in stages. First, the mild curiosity of a man's seeing an unfamiliar woman approach him. Then the slight narrowing that meant something was familiar. Then the specific stillness of a man whose body has recognized something before his mind has caught up. Then his mind caught up. "Irene Sullivan," he said. His voice was steady. I'll give him that. Whatever else he wasn't a man who frightened easily, Admiral, I said. I used the title because I was raised to use titles, and because not using it would have been its own kind of performance. He shifted his drink to his left hand. "I didn't know you'd be here. My husband went to school with your son," I said. He nodded slowly. How are you? It's a remarkable question to ask someone in that circumstance. How are you, the full social machinery running even here, even now? I almost admired it. I'm fine, I said. I wanted to ask you something. The club manager had evaporated, the way people with good instincts evaporate when the air in a conversation changes. Garrett waited. Daniel Reyes, I said. Something moved in his face. Not guilt, or not only guilt, something more complicated. The expression of a man who has carried a specific weight for long enough that he's made a kind of peace with it, and is now being asked to put it back on the scale. I remember the inquiry, he said carefully. I want to know if you believed the finding, I said. Not whether you signed it. Whether you believed it. A long pause. Sullivan? It's a simple question, I said. I'm not recording this. I'm not building a case. I'm asking you, one person to another, whether you believed I held that hover too long. He looked at me for a moment. Around us, the party continued its business. Glasses clinking. Conversation overlapping. Someone telling a joke inside that landed with a burst of laughter. The ordinary noise of people who didn't know they were standing next to something real. The conditions were extraordinary, he said finally. The board acknowledged that. That's not what I asked. He was quiet. The board needed a clean resolution, he said. There were elements of that operation that couldn't survive public scrutiny. The coordination failures, the intelligence gaps, the authorization chain. If those came out, he stopped. He looked at his drink. The finding was the cleanest path to closure. At my expense, I said. He didn't deny it. I'll give him that too. You were the ranking flight officer, he said. The finding was technically defensible. Technically, I said. Yes, a pause. Technically. I stood with that for a moment. 4 years of carrying something alone, and here it was, confirmed in a single word on a terrace in Virginia. Not an apology, not a confession. Just an adverb that cracked the whole thing open. Danny Reyes had a mother, I said. She spent years trying to understand what happened to her son. The official report didn't tell her anything real. Garrett said nothing. She deserved better than technically, I said. He looked away, toward the tree line, and in his profile I saw something I hadn't expected. Not defiance, not the smooth political surface, but something older and heavier. The face of a man who had made a calculation a long time ago and had been living in the compound interest of it ever since. I turned to go. He said behind me, very quietly, Sullivan. I stopped. I'm sorry, he said. Just that. No elaboration, no qualification. The plain 3 words, said to my back, in a voice that had lost all of its studied steadiness. I didn't turn around. I didn't say you should be, or it's too late, or it doesn't matter. I said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer, and I walked back across the terrace toward Doc Hayes and my water glass and the warm September air. And behind me I heard faintly the sound of Mark's voice saying my name. Not Irene. Not Hay. My name, said carefully. The way you say something you're learning the weight of for the first time. Mark was standing where I'd left him. Not with the group anymore. Alone, a few feet from where Tom and Bill Carey had drifted back into the party, holding his drink with both hands the way people hold things is when they need something to do with their hands. He was watching me cross the terrace, not the way he'd watched me earlier in the evening, that careful, assessing watch, the one that was really about how I reflected on him. This was different, rawer, the look of a man who has been standing in one place long enough for the ground to shift under him. I stopped in front of him. He said, "Who was that man?" "Thomas Garrett," I said, "retired Rear Admiral. He ran the inquiry board after my 3rd deployment. Mark absorbed that. I watched him process it the way you watch someone work through a math problem that keeps coming out wrong. Going back, checking the steps, finding where the error entered. The inquiry, he said. What kind of inquiry? The kind they convene when a mission goes badly and someone needs to absorb the finding, I said. Danny Reyes died on my watch. The board concluded it was pilot error. My error, Mark's face did something complicated. But it wasn't. No, I said. It wasn't. He was quiet for a long moment. Around us, the party continued. Someone had started a playlist inside that was too young for the crowd, and a few people were drifting toward the parking lot. And the cicadas were still going in the tree line, indifferent to all of it. The world keeps moving anyway, it always does. Why didn't you tell me, he said. There it was, the question I'd been waiting for all evening. All 4 years, if I was honest. I'd rehearsed versions of the answer in my head 100 times, patient versions, careful versions, versions that went easy on both of us. Standing here now, in this particular air, I found I didn't want any of those versions. Because I came home empty, I said. Because I left a man in the water and spent 2 years in an inquiry that blamed me for it, and when it was over, I didn't know how to talk about any of it without the whole weight of it coming through. And I didn't know if you could hold that weight, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. He looked at me. You didn't give me the chance. No, I said, I didn't. That's the truth of it. Not a defense, not an accusation. Just the plain accounting of what happened between two people who stopped finding their way toward each other and settled for a life that ran alongside instead. I kept things from him. He stopped asking. We built something functional out of those two facts and called it a marriage and mostly didn't look at the seams. The truck, he said suddenly. I looked at him. That's why you kept it, he said. The truck? Yes. His jaw was tight. Not anger. Something more interior than anger. You've been carrying all of this since before I knew you properly. I've been carrying it since 2009, I said. Some of it longer. He looked at his drink. He set it down on the nearest table, carefully, like a man putting down something he no longer trusted himself to hold. Then he looked back at me and said, I stood there tonight and I made fun of that truck in front of people. In front of. He stopped. I didn't know what it meant, but I should have known it meant something. You don't hold on to a thing like that for no reason? No, I said. You don't. Older Americans understand something about marriages that the young haven't learned yet. That love and knowing are not the same thing. That you can love someone for years and still have whole rooms of them you've never been inside. That the failure to know isn't always cruelty or indifference. Sometimes it's just two people moving through their lives so close together that they stop actually looking at each other. Because looking takes a kind of stillness that daily life doesn't budget for. Mark and I had failed each other in ordinary ways, the kind that don't make good stories but accumulate slowly into a distance you one day notice has become the default. He said, 9 men. 9 we confirmed, I said. Danny makes 10, if you count him differently. Which I do. He looked at me for a long moment, then he said, quietly, I've been embarrassed about the truck for 3 years. I've been embarrassed. He stopped. Swallowed. I called you mediocre tonight. Not to your face, but I said it where you could hear it, which is the same thing, I know. I'm sorry, he said. Irene, I'm genuinely sorry. I looked at him. At the face I'd woken up next to for 11 years. The face of a man who was not bad, not cruel, not malicious, but who had let his own smallness make decisions for him, the way people do when they haven't examined what's really driving them. I'd done the same, in different directions. We'd both been operating out of the unexamined parts of ourselves for a long time. I know you are, I said. And then, because the evening wasn't finished with us yet, I heard Davis's voice behind me. Sharp, carrying, aimed at someone across the terrace. I think people are getting a little carried away. She flew helicopters. It's not like she stormed the beach at Normandy. The group near the bar went very quiet. Tom Carey turned to look at Davis with an expression I recognized. The expression of a man with a very short remaining tolerance for a very specific kind of person. Bill Carey had already straightened, and from near the stone wall, Doc Hayes was standing up, not fast, not dramatically. Just the slow, deliberate rising of a man with bad knees and absolute certainty about what he was going to say next. He crossed the terrace with that careful walk, and he stopped a few feet from Davis, and he looked at him with those gray eyes for a long moment before he spoke. Son, he said. And he said it the way men say it when they don't mean it as a compliment. I was in the water that night. I have held that woman's name in my chest for 15 years. Because I watched her do something most people don't survive. I don't know what you've done with your 15 years that makes you think you can weigh it against hers. But I'd think carefully before you finish that sentence. Davis opened his mouth. He closed it again. The terrace was very still. And in that stillness, something changed. Not loudly, not with ceremony, just the quiet, irreversible way that the measure of a room changes when someone tells the truth plainly, and the truth turns out to be bigger than the space it was being kept in. The silence after Doc spoke lasted about 4 seconds. That's longer than it sounds when 60 people are holding it together. Davis stood with his mouth slightly open and his drink in his hand, and the specific expression of a man who has spent his whole life being the sharpest voice in the room and has just discovered, at a country club reunion on a September evening, that he is not in the room he thought he was in. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't start a new one. He took a small step back, the way people step back from heat, and he looked at his drink and then at the ground, and then somewhere off to the left where there was nothing in particular to look at. It was, I thought, the most honest thing he'd done all evening. Doc didn't watch him retreat. He'd already turned back toward the stone wall, moving slowly, his job done in his mind before anyone else's had caught up. Tom Carey said, to no one specifically, "Good," and then the silence broke. Not into chaos, but into the low murmur of a crowd that has collectively processed something and is now redistributing itself. People shifted. Conversations restarted at different volumes, in different configurations. The whole social geometry of the terrace rearranged quietly around what had just happened. Greg, who had been standing near the bar throughout, set his drink down and walked over to me. He had the look of a man making a decision he should have made earlier, and knew it. He extended his hand. "I didn't know," he said. "Any of it. I want to be clear that I would have." He stopped. "Started again. I owe you an apology for earlier. The comments about the car. The whole tone of it." He paused. "I'm sorry." I shook his hand. "Thank you," I said. "It was a simple exchange. No drama in it, no score settling. Just two people adjusting to new information and deciding to be decent about it. That mattered to me more than the grand gestures, if I'm honest. The small corrections. The willingness to say I was wrong and mean it without making the apology itself the performance." Patty appeared at my elbow. She had been crying, I could see, not weeping, just the contained, careful kind that happens when something touches a place you weren't expecting. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand briefly on my arm and squeezed once, and I understood everything she meant by it. The veterans found me next. I hadn't known there were others. That's always how it is. You walk into a room and you don't know who's there until the room shifts and they step forward. There were 4 of them at this reunion. Tom Carey, it turned out, had done 2 years in the Army before his knee ended it. Bill had served as a Navy JAG attorney for 8 years. A woman named Louise, who had been quiet on the far end of the terrace all evening, had been an Air Force flight nurse for 12 years. And a man named Roy, who taught high school history now and had been so unremarkable looking all evening that I'd mentally filed him under background. Roy had been a Marine infantryman for 7 years and had the kind of stillness about him that you only get from having been very close to very loud things. They came over one by one, not in a group, not formally, just drifting over the way veterans drift toward each other in civilian spaces. The mutual recognition, the unspoken shorthand, the slight relief of being near someone who doesn't need things explained. Roy shook my hand and said, "Commander," just that, just the rank. It was enough. Louise told me she'd flown medical evacs out of Bagram, and that the weather conditions I'd described sounded like 2 nights she tried not to think about. She said it flatly, without self-pity, and I understood her completely. Bill Carey said, carefully, the inquiry finding. "Is there anything that can be done?" "It's been 4 years," I said. "That doesn't always matter," he said. He was precise about it, not offering false hope, just noting a legal reality with the exactness of someone who had spent years in courtrooms. "I'd like to look at it, if you'd allow me." "Not tonight." "But if you'd allow me." I looked at him. at his quiet, careful face, at the way he'd straightened when he heard my rank earlier, at the way he'd watched all evening with those eyes that missed nothing. "All right," I said. "Yes." He nodded once and handed me a card from his breast pocket. The practiced move of a man who always carries them. I put it in my dress pocket and thought about Danny Reyes's mother and what it might mean to call her someday with something different to say. Doc had settled back into his chair by the stone wall. I went and sat beside him. The party was winding down. People gathering jackets, finding their spouses, doing the long, slow exit ritual of events like this. The music inside had stopped. The cicadas were still going. The air had cooled slightly, the way Virginia air does when the evening tips past 10 o'clock and remembers, it's September. "You doing all right?" Doc asked. "Yes," I said. And I meant it, which surprised me a little. "Garrett left," he said, 20 minutes ago. Didn't say goodbye to many people." I nodded. I'd half expected that. Men like Garrett don't stay in rooms that have rearranged around them. They find the exit and they use it, and they regroup somewhere private. His son seemed confused, Doc said. I don't think Garrett had ever told him much about his career. "The real parts," he paused. "There's a pattern in that." "There is," I said. We sat for a while in comfortable silence. "The kind that only exists between people who have been through something together, even if the something happened 15 years apart." Mark appeared at the edge of my vision. He was standing a few feet away, not intruding, waiting. When I looked at him, he came over and stood in front of us and said to Doc, "I'd like to thank you for what you said tonight." "For all of it," Doc looked at him steadily. "I didn't know," Mark said. It was the third time he'd said some version of that tonight, and each time it had meant something slightly different. This time it meant something closer to, I didn't try hard enough to know, which is not the same thing as didn't know but is more honest, and he seemed to understand that. Locke said, "She didn't make it easy." "No," Mark said, "but I didn't make it safe." He paused. "That's on me." Doc looked at him for a long moment, then he looked at me, then back at Mark, and he said, "Son, I've been watching people my whole life. You're not beyond fixing." Mark let out a breath. Something in his shoulders came down that had been up all evening. "Sit down," Doc said. "I'll tell you about the night your wife saved my life." 3 weeks passed before Mark and I had the real conversation. Not the one on the terrace. That was the beginning of something. Not the thing itself. The beginning was necessary, and I don't regret how it happened. But beginnings are not the same as the work. The work came later, in the kitchen and the living room, and once on the back porch at 11 at night, with biscuit between us and the Virginia, dark pressing in from the tree line, and 2 cups of tea that went cold because neither of us wanted to interrupt the other to reheat them. He asked me to tell him everything. Not the outline, the real version. The one with the weather data and the flight logs and the sound of the hoist failing and the 40 minutes circling in the dark looking for Danny. The one with the inquiry and the finding and the specific language of the censure document that I had memorized without meaning to. The one with the years after, when I came home and let silence fill in around me like insulation, keeping the cold out but also keeping everything else out too, I told him. All of it. He listened the way I hadn't known he could listen, without interrupting, without trying to fix it, without offering the kind of reassurances that are really just requests for the other person to stop being in pain because it's making you uncomfortable. He just sat with it. And when I was done, he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "I'm sorry I wasn't someone you felt safe telling." It's a different thing to say than "I'm sorry I didn't know." I noticed the difference. I think he intended me to. "I wasn't easy to tell," I said. "I made it hard." "You did," he said. "But I also stopped trying. I told myself you were private, that it was your choice. And those things were true, but they were also convenient. They let me stop pushing without having to admit I'd stopped. People over 60 understand that kind of honesty between 2 people. The kind that doesn't assign all the fault to one side. The kind that says we both made choices, and here we are, in the aftermath of those choices, And the question now is not who was more wrong, but whether there's something worth rebuilding in the space between us. I didn't know the answer to that yet. I don't think Mark did either. But we were asking the question, which was more than we'd done in a long time. In the second week after the reunion, Bill Carey called. He'd spent 10 days reviewing the inquiry record. I had sent him my copies, everything I'd kept in a file box in the back of the closet. For 4 years, the file box I'd never opened at home because opening it meant having to explain it. He called me on a Tuesday evening while Mark was making dinner, and I sat in the bedroom with the door half closed and listened to Bill's careful, precise voice walk me through what he'd found. The weather data had been misrepresented in the board's findings, not falsified outright. The records were there, technically, but selectively cited in a way that excluded the rogue wave pattern that the task force meteorologist had flagged in his preliminary report. That report had been entered into the inquiry record, but not cited in the final finding. Bill had found it in 40 minutes with a clear eye and no stake in the outcome. He said it quietly, the way he said everything quietly. "This is reviewable," he said. "The selective omission of material evidence in a formal inquiry finding is reviewable. It won't be fast. It won't be simple. But it's reviewable." I sat with that for a moment. "Danny's mother," I said. "Elena Reyes. She lives in San Antonio. She's been carrying an incomplete story for 15 years, I know," he said. "I'd like your permission to reach out to her with the appropriate documentation. She has a right to know that the official account of her son's death was built on an incomplete record." "Yes," I said. "Please." I sat in the bedroom for a while after we hung up, looking at nothing in particular. The smell of whatever Mark was cooking drifted under the door. Something with garlic and olive oil, something warm and ordinary. Biscuit nosed the door open and came and put his head in my lap, and I rested my hand on his ears and thought about Danny Reyes at 26 years old, in the water, in the dark, doing exactly what he'd trained to do. He deserved a true record. His mother deserved a true story. However long it took to get there, those things were in motion now, and that mattered. Mark appeared in the doorway. He looked at my face and didn't ask. He just said, 10 minutes, and went back to the kitchen. That was new. The not asking, the reading of the room, the giving of space without being asked for it. Small things. The kind of small things that accumulated over time are actually the substance of what it means to know someone. We were learning each other, slowly. In the wrong order, maybe, 11 years in and starting over in some fundamental way. But the order didn't matter as much as the fact of it. I went to the kitchen. I set the table. I poured the water. He put the food down and we sat across from each other and he said, "Tell me something I don't know about you." I looked at him across the table. At this man I'd chosen and kept at arm's length and was now cautiously, in the slow and imperfect way of real things, letting closer. "Danny Reyes used to sing," I said. "Off-key, all the time in the hangar. Old country songs he half remembered. It drove the deck crews insane." I paused. I loved it. I never told him. Mark was quiet for a moment. "What songs?" he said. "Hank Williams," I said, "mostly." He only knew the choruses. Mark smiled. Not the party smile, not the performance. The real one, the smaller one, the one I'd first fallen in love with. "Of course he did," he said. "We ate dinner." The food was good. Biscuit sat hopefully between our chairs. The Virginia dark pressed against the windows, and the night was quiet and ordinary. And somewhere between the first course and the last I understood that ordinary was not the small thing I'd once let myself believe it was. Ordinary, tended carefully, is everything. A year later, I drove the truck to San Antonio. Mark offered to come. I told him this was something I needed to do alone, and he understood that without requiring me to explain it further, which is its own kind of progress between two people. He stood in the driveway when I left. Early on a Thursday morning, coffee in hand, Biscuit sitting beside him with that long, confused face, and he raised his cup as I pulled out. I raised 2 fingers off the steering wheel, our version of something. The drive took 2 days. I took the long way through Tennessee and into Arkansas, and down through Texas, Because I didn't see the point of flying when the point was the going. The truck ran fine. It always runs fine. People don't understand old things that keep working. They see the rust and the age and they make judgments. They don't see what the thing has been through and is still standing after. Elena Reyes lived in a small house on the east side of San Antonio. Pale yellow with a front garden she kept carefully and a flag mounted beside the door. Not a decorative flag, a real one, folded tight in a shadow box frame. She was 61 years old, small, with Danny's eyes. I knew they were Danny's eyes because I had looked into his face in the water for 40 minutes, and I had never stopped seeing it. She opened the door before I'd finished knocking. I think she'd been expecting me for a long time. Not me specifically, but someone. Some accounting, eventually, of what had really happened to her son on that night in October 2009. She'd spent 15 years living inside an official story that had always felt wrong, the way a room feels wrong when the furniture has been moved in the night, and you can't quite identify what's different. We sat at her kitchen table for 4 hours. I told her everything. The weather. The water. The way Danny had held onto that survivor when the wave hit. The instinct of a trained man. The refusal to let go even when letting go might have saved him. I told her that her son was doing exactly the right thing in exactly the right way, and that what happened to him was not negligence and not error, and not the result of anyone's failure except the weather's, which is not a failure at all, just the indifference of the world, which is terrible enough without adding blame to it. She listened without crying. Then she cried. Then she was done crying and she made coffee and we drank it, and she asked me questions. Small, specific questions about what he was like, what he said, whether he was afraid. I answered everyone. He wasn't afraid. I know that sounds like the thing people say, but I was watching him and I know the difference between a man performing courage and a simply Nazi, through training and character, become someone to whom this is the job. Danny Reyes was the second kind. He was the job all the way through, and I have never stopped being grateful that I got to fly with him. She walked me to the truck when I left. She looked at it for a moment. The rust, the age, the dents that had come from years of being a working thing in a working life, and she said, "He would have liked this truck." I laughed, real laughter, surprised out of me. "Yeah," I said, "he would have." She hugged me at the door. A long hug, the kind that has weight and intention in it. I held on the drive home. I thought about call signs. People hear the word and they think cool. They think Top Gun. They think ego. They think men in flight suits choosing dangerous-sounding names for themselves to perform a version of themselves they want the world to see. Sometimes that's true. I've known those people. But that's not where the real ones come from. The real ones come from the thing you did. The moment the people around you witnessed and named. You don't choose it. You can't. Someone else looks at you in the aftermath of something real and decides what it meant and hands it to you. And if you're lucky, what they hand you is true. If you're lucky, the name they give you is a receipt, evidence of something that happened, proof of what it cost. Mine came from a crew chief named Harris, who was 22 years old and had never flown in weather like that before, and was certain for about 90 minutes of that mission that he was going to die. When we landed and he climbed out and looked at the sky, the breaking up clouds, the first gray light of morning starting to come in over the Gulf, he said I looked like something out of the Bible, something with a glow around it. Halo, he said, like you had a halo. I told him that was the stupidest call sign I'd ever heard. It stuck anyway. They always do, the ones you argue with. For a long time I carried it like a burden, like an irony, like the universe's sense of humor, giving a name that meant light and grace to a woman who had come home from that mission and been told she'd made the wrong call. A halo for the pilot who lost one. I understand it differently now. A halo isn't something you earn by being perfect. It's not a reward. It's what the people on the ground see when someone comes out of the dark toward them in the worst hour of their lives. It doesn't belong to the person wearing it. It belongs to the moment, to the specific quality of light that appears when help arrives after everyone has stopped believing it will. I didn't deserve that name because I was perfect. I deserved it because I showed up. Because I stayed in the hover when it would have been defensible to climb out. Because Danny Reyes held on in the water and 9 other men came home to their families, and the receipt for that is still in my chest where I keep it, where it will stay. That's what a call sign is, when it's real, not a trophy, a receipt. Proof of what something cost and evidence that the cost was paid. Older Americans know this in their bones. You've lived long enough to know that the quiet people in the room are often the ones carrying the heaviest things. That the person in the old truck might have a story that would rearrange you. That dignity doesn't announce itself. It just keeps showing up, in whatever weather, and doing the work. If there's someone in your life like that, someone you've overlooked, someone you've filed under unimportant because they didn't perform their worth loudly enough for the room, I hope this story finds its way to them. Not as a lesson, just as a reminder. They already know who they are. Sometimes it helps to be seen. Drive safe. Take care of each other. And if you're listening from somewhere in this wide, complicated country tonight, or somewhere beyond it, drop your location in the comments. Tell me where you are. It always means something to know who's out there in the dark.